All right. So yeah, we do 40,000 onions at 4 inches, as it says. So we're doing 4-inch paper chains. And I believe this year we did 6 different varieties. So I'm shooting for 3 varieties of early plantings or early harvest onions, and then 3 different varieties of storage onions. So I usually do like 2 varieties of a yellow onion that's storage and 1 variety of a purple that's storage. There are not any white onions, as far as I can tell, that store much longer than a couple months. So we do some white onions, but not a ton. Usually those will harvest right away and just get them harvested and sold and out of the way, and then store the rest of them. You can switch to the next one. This picture here is showing about a week from our seeding. So they pop up, stay pretty small. We typically cover all these trays then with some plastic. So in a couple slides down, you'll see that we got some plastic hanging. And so we just fold that plastic over and just kind of create a mini greenhouse environment there. All these trays are sitting on our hydroponic lettuce bench early in the season before we get that all started. So we just kind of use some of that as greenhousing space. So at this stage, about a week, you can kind of start to see what your percentage of germination is. You can really, we kind of get right down at that level and take a look across and just see, how we're doing it. At this stage, you can pretty easily see if you're going to have trays that are, either have big open spots or if they just didn't germinate, hardly at all. Then you kind of know about what your numbers are. Sometimes we'll go through and retransplant out of some trays into others and just consolidate, or we'll go through and just use a pencil or something, punch a hole and reseed, set those off to the side, give them a little bit more time to germinate, and then we just do those all last. Any variety that's doing that, we'll just set off one bed, plant them all out, the late ones, and they're pretty easy to tell apart. Our red varieties, they're typically pop up, germinate a little bit later than our yellow and our white varieties. White tends to be pretty quick coming up, and then actually some of our storage ones germinate faster even than our early spring ones. You can move to the next one. So the only downfall that we typically see is the amount of tray space needed. Not only storage space, place to put the trays out and hold on to them until they're ready to go out, but also just the amount of trays that we need to have. So we're doing 151 trays for 40,000 onions because it's 264 cells per tray. So that works out to 151 plus a little bit. We always do a little extra. So when we're talking 40,000 onions, I'm ordering between 5,000 and 8,000 of each of those varieties. We're doing a little extra just to make sure that, we have enough. We typically plan on 20%. I think that's what a lot of farms do anyways on everything that they're doing, about a 20% overage, and that way you got enough. The time commitment to putting out, rolling out the paper chains as compared to like a hand planting, we've done both. We did a lot of hand planting in the past. But with the paper chains, they really roll out fast. I'm able to put out all 40,000 of those onions and some leeks and shallots all in about maybe a day and a half, depending on if I have some help. If the soil is right, everything's good to go there, and we can get the rows marked out, and I got somebody that's able to kind of follow behind me with more trays, so I can just continue to roll out a tray, pull off the empty, put the next one on, and keep going. That makes it go a lot faster. Otherwise, I go along and set out trays at about 16 paces, which is usually enough. I pretty much land right on them at that point. So I'll set out some trays ahead of myself, but if I can have a person that follows along and is just there to hand me new trays of ready to go plants, then it makes it a lot faster. You can go to the next one. So this is the picture I was talking about. You can see all the trays of onions sitting out on those benches there, and then that plastic that's hanging down. That is enough actually to flip over and cover all the trays there. So we just throw that plastic over them until they start to pop up and germinate, push that plastic up. Then we pull it down. And from that point on, we're starting to get into March timeframe. So it's warming up. The days are a little bit longer. Those greenhouses are starting to warm up pretty quick. So we're able to pull that plastic up and just let them be. The bench space there, those 151 trays there are covering is about 100 foot long. It's, I got a note there that says 8 varieties, 5,000 each. It's 8 varieties, but it really, we were trying different things here. So typically what we're running is 6, maybe 7 varieties all told, typically 6, 3, like I said, 3 early, 3 late. But you can kind of see what space requirement there is. So it does take up a lot of space just to hold the trays, get them to that point of being able to put them outside. You do need a lot of greenhouse space or floor space or somewhere that you can put those all in and care for them. You can move on. So this is just a little picture of some trim tops here. You can see kind of in the background some that haven't been done yet. That's kind of why I took that picture. You can see the front ones we probably did a couple days in advance, and then that picture was taken just before we kept moving on and trimming the rest of them. So I know a lot of times, especially with onions, people get concerned about having onions in paper chains for too long. Some concern is that the paper isn't going to hold up. That has not been the case that we've seen so far. The paper holds up just fine. The chains are great. And there is enough soil in those cells to be able to take onions from seed to being able to transplant them out or roll them out. We do give them all an overhead watering, like a fertigation. This is where those onion trays is in our hydroponic setup. So we have, the ability to do some water soluble nutrients, mix up a little bit of, just a little shot of nutrient water for them. It's a 2-part component. So phosphates and nitrates, basically. It's a pretty basic mix, but you can get by with dissolving, just a standard all-purpose plant food. We've done that in the past. We use a product called Monty's. They kind of have an all-purpose liquid. You just mix that in with some water and overhead water on those. It's enough just to keep them green, give them a little boost, and not have to worry about the fact that, that potting soil isn't going to hold on to a whole lot. We can typically do 2 trimmings per variety. So there's enough soil there, enough space that we can trim them twice and let them be. And then they got a note there, just one addition of fertigation in tray before we plant them out. So give them a little shot, get them all the way through, and typically they make it no problem. You can go to the next one. For soil prep, you definitely want a nice loose soil. We shoot for minimal rocks, as good as you can. I mean, the biggest problem with rocks is if you get a decent sized one that's below the ground, you can't see it as you're rolling the paper chains out. That underneath the planter, there's like a tooth that makes a furrow. Sometimes that tooth will hit a rock underneath and kind of shift it one way or the other. It's not a huge problem. You can typically correct it pretty easily. The issue comes when you're trying to do weeding later on. If your soil or if your planter hits that rock and it shoots it off to the side a little bit, and that one row has got a curve in it, then if you are using some kind of mechanical weeder that's doing a couple rows at a time, chances are you might lose an onion or 2, or you'll pick up a chain if they're not all rooted down real good. Try to shoot for minimal debris and trash. So like old plant stalks, anything like that, we try to go through and get some of that out of there. We do rototill at our place. I try to do as little as possible because I know that destroys soil structure, but putting out the paper chains, you want a nice loose soil. You want to prep that soil properly. You can do raised beds or flat ground. We use paper chains for more than just onions. We're doing beans early in the season, green yellow beans. We're doing beets, kohlrabi and stuff like that. And I put a lot of that stuff on raised beds. The onions I typically do on flat ground because I was trying to do a mechanical finger weeding pull behind our BCS. So we'll talk about weeding as we go through here, but raised beds or flat ground, either way. Biggest thing is just making sure you don't have a ton of trash or rocks in your soil, and then having a moderate kind of moderate low soil moisture content is necessary. You want enough that it can kind of pack, and those weighted wheels at the end can pack the soil in around those chains, but you don't want it so wet that you actually make clumps as you're trying to pull that unit through the soil. So you just want to make sure that your soil moisture level isn't either too much or too little. It's too little, too dry. It's not, it'll pull a bunch of soil over the onion sets or over the chains, but it really won't pack down. And at that point, you're going to have problems later on when you're trying to water them in and get them set. So a little bit of moisture in the ground is good, but you want to make sure it's not too much. So with your spacing in that, you can get 2, 4, or 6 inch. Some people use either tape to block off some holes in the drop seeder, or they use, there's trays that are sold to give you a little bit better spacing. And then the amount of space between your rows all depends on the type of crop that you're doing. Onions, you can cram in pretty good unless you're trying to do a mechanical weeder of some sort where you need tire space or whatever. In the next slide, you'll see the picture. We got it pretty spaced out. That's 15 inches so that we can try running finger weeders there. We have run up to 6 rows in a 30-inch bed top. It gets tight and you got to kind of figure how to do it. So I usually run 3 rows pretty spaced out and then fill the next 3 rows in next to them. Firm bed and bed edges help a lot. So, if you got a good bed maker, if you're trying to do raised beds, like a 30-inch top raised bed, having a bed maker that's going to pack that bed top nice and firm really helps with being able to fit all 6 in a 30-inch bed top. You can move on. So this is that picture I was talking about. That's 15 inches between rows there. And the reason for that is we were trying to run finger weeders on a unit that we built to pull behind our BCS. So we have a pull unit that we use to mark out 3 or 4 rows at a time. And then we can just come through with the planter and pull it along down that row. They're fairly straight. These rows here are, you can see a couple spots where maybe we hit a rock or something and it shifted it a little bit. At that point, you got to watch out when you're doing your next row. Try not to follow along that same line. If you curved off one way, try to straighten it out the next time. And then you just got to keep an eye on it when you're going back to weed later on. But the straighter the rows you can do, the better. You adjust your depth depending on the size of your crop that you're putting in. Usually onions, being that they're trimmed, they're nice and stocky, they can hold up to being put pretty deep. So I really try to bury them as deep as I can where at least I'm not folding over the onion set. So as I'm laying it on the ground, if I'm pulling too much dirt over top, I'll raise that up a little bit and set them a little bit shallower. But I like to really bury that chain because then the first rain that we get really sets in the onion roots. They get a nice set in the ground. They're held in that way when I come back later on to weed. If I hit the chain, the onion sets are set in there, the chain will pull up over top of the onions and the onions will stay in the ground. I don't have to worry about it. So it's nice to adjust that, and you can adjust your depth depending on your soil structure also. If you got nice, soft, sandy soil, you can get it pretty deep. If you got real hard, clumpy soil, you're going to probably be doing a little bit more skimming across the top. Um, pull the unit as smooth and even as you can, straight rows as you can. You'll be able to feel as you use it to see what your adjustment should be. If you want to put more weight on the back tires or kind of lift up and take some weight off of there and allow a little bit more weight on the front packing tires, you'll be able to adjust it based on your soil structure and that. We typically like to give all the paper chains a shot of water, probably 2, maybe 3 hours before we start putting them out. So if it's, early in the season, like in the picture here, you see there's no leaves on the trees there. So we're talking probably April, early May, in our climate here. And, so I'll water them maybe on Monday, give them a good shot, and then we'll start planting out on a Tuesday. And typically that watering on Monday is enough to get them through Tuesday and Wednesday. And by then I got pretty much all of them out. So getting them a little wet, you just don't want them to be dry. The drier they are, the chains stick together, or if you have any algae growth on the top from your, the amount of time that they sit in the nursery or in a greenhouse, they will grow some algae that'll kind of connect the chains on the top. And you don't really realize it until you're putting them out and they're starting to pull each other out of the cells. So we take and kind of make sure that all the roots that are growing through the bottom of the tray are gone. We just take that orange thing that slides in under the chains, and we just scrape that across the bottom, trim off any roots that are growing through, because that'll hold the onion in the tray. The cell with the soil will pull right over top of the onion, and then you're planting out an empty cell. So we'll trim those roots and just slide that thing underneath there and start setting them out. And just keep an eye on it as you're doing it. It goes pretty easy. You can move on. For weed control, we got a couple different things. So the unit in the right-hand picture there, that's just like for going in between rows, that's about 30 inches wide, maybe adjustable, but that's just for covering, I'll do single rows of leaks. That way you can see right behind it, there's some leaks laid out that are double the spacing. So that's 30 inches instead of 15. We'll use that unit there to go in between there and just kind of bust up the ground. Leaks we end up coming through with wire weeders or handheld wire hose and weeding in between them. For the onions that are spaced closer, then we use a unit that we built for the back of our BCS. I don't believe I have any pictures of that. I should have put some pictures in here on that. If anybody's interested in pictures on how we built that, I can send just text some pictures or email pictures of how we built that. It's a pretty basic unit. It works pretty good. The BCS is not the ideal unit to pull finger weeder behind. It all has to do with the height of the unit and the wheel spacing and all that. So we messed with it for a while, and we got all kinds of different adjustable pieces for the BCS, and it works. It's just not ideal. So but weeding is definitely the hardest part. I mean, that's whether you're using paper chains or not, weeding is difficult, when you're doing small, intricate crops like that. And then depending on the spacing that you're doing, all of our onions are done at 4 inches. So trying to get in-row weeding done at 4 inches is a struggle for sure. You can move on. So what we found for taking care of weeds is doing early bed prep. That can be said for a lot of different crops. So I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know there, but that does seem to be the best. Really just kind of creating a stale seed bed is the best thing that you can do. We've done some flame weeding in the past. I have my reservations on flame weeding. I use it a lot for like carrots and that, but sometimes I get really good luck with it. Sometimes it seems like it speeds the weeds up. I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with weed seed bank and the types of weeds that are there. We get a lot of crabgrass in that, and I don't think that the flame weeding is necessarily the best thing for crabgrasses. I think it kind of speeds that up and warms up the soil enough in a concentrated area that then they start poking up, and becomes a problem. But early bed prep is definitely the key. So getting a stale seed bed set and taking care of those weeds before they really start to become a problem is huge. We use the finger weeders. It works. They will work with paper chains. We haven't had any issues where the finger weeders are pulling the chain up. Again, we talked about it earlier with how deep you plant those or lay those chains in. If you get them nice and deep, the finger weeders won't mess with them too much. You do kind of have to allow those roots to set in though. We've used a tine weeder. Gotta be careful. I have issues with tine weeders also. They tend to tear up a crop a little bit. Onions are pretty hardy. But onions, I'm always concerned about, prematurely laying those tops over. You bend those over too much or too many times or back and forth, and you kind of crack or destroy that cell structure in the neck. I think that really, really stunts an onion. Obviously you're shooting for nice size onions. The fewer amount of onions to a pound, the better for market sales. So, try to really keep the onion tops looking nice. So I tend to, shy away from tine weeders if I can. Wheel hose, like the double wheel hoe, the Haas wheel hoe with stirrup hose or the beat knives seem to work really, really good. It doesn't get in between the onions, but if you can keep the aisles clear, your in-row stuff is fairly easy to handle hand pulling or with a wire weeder, a handheld wire weeder. Typically we were able to handle weeds for the most part, at least get the onions to start sizing up before the weeds kind of took over by using those wheel hose and using wire weeders in between and getting in there a couple times as they were younger. Once they started to size up, I would let the jungle grow because we took care of it for the most part, got them to a certain point. They started sizing up. They should be able to beat out most of the weed pressure. At that point, the hardest part is just going in there and harvesting through the weeds. But, as long as onions size up, it's a fairly easy task.
Planning out 151 trays, what's the area that takes up in the field at the row spacing you're at?
That's a good question. So we do 15-inch between row. Our bed blocks or our field blocks are 150 foot long. The chains at 4-inch are like
90 feet.
Yeah, 93 feet, I think. Yeah. Something like that, 92, 93 feet. So yeah, once, I can do, it's like a tray and a part. And then I come down the next row and just keep going. This year we left some space in between each variety, a little bit more space. So I skipped the whole row to leave that 30 inches so that we could walk down there and check things over a little bit better. I would say it probably took, it probably takes somewhere around 230 some feet, maybe, long by the 150 wide. Mm-hmm. So to get that spacing out. So it does take up quite a bit, at, 15-inch, in row spacing. You could probably get that a little bit closer. This year we're going to do some chains and some direct planted. We got a new water wheel transplanter with 3 seats and a 3-row offset space on it. So we're going to do some in beds because I really want to get some big giant onions. We get decent size onions, but not as many as I'd like. A lot of my customers are looking for, a 3 to 4 inch round outside diameter onions. So we're going to do some in beds with black plastic and drip to really puff them up. And then I get a lot of customers that talk about how they really enjoy the size of our onions because they're not huge. So my market customers, my CSA members, they like a smaller onion. And we've always produced a little bit more of a medium to small size onion. Nice and round. They look great. They're just a smaller onion when we're doing the paper chains. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're not able to be as efficient with weed control as I'd like.
Yeah.
I think that's what keeps them a little bit smaller. So I think we could get them a little bit closer if you had, a way, if somebody had good luck with tine weeding, they could probably get 3 to 4 rows on a 32 inch bed top and really push them in a little bit. So I think it all depends on what you're looking to do.
Along the sizing, how did you arrive at 4-inch chains versus 6-inch chains? 6-inch chains, bigger in row spacing, more space, bigger onion. You're using 4-inch. Why the 4-inch?
The 4-inch was a nice size for the spacing in between. We found that at 4-inch, if they puffed up to be as big as we wanted them to, if we were able to get the amount of nutrient that they needed in the water and everything out for the season, and we had a good year on them, that 4-inch was just the right amount of space where they would almost touch in between. The 6-inch was almost too big. That allowed too much space in between for weeds. And I've always struggled a little bit more with planting out things in a 6-inch space on the paper chains. I have a problem with twisting. And I don't know if it's the way I have it set up. But typically everything we're doing is either between a 2 and a 4-inch, and 4-inch being the most used on our farm. And onions just kind of fell right into that. It seemed to be the proper spacing without having issues while we're planting out, and the proper spacing that they had enough space for the growing season to get to the right size, where the 6-inch, that extra space isn't necessary.
With your trimming that you're doing here, well, a couple questions on this. One, what's the total time in cell, say, from seeding to when you transplant them out into the field? And when is your first trimming? When's your second trimming generally? Is it based on height?
Yeah, typically we wait until they're 6 to 8 inches high, and then we trim them back to like the 4 inches or so. So typically I'm waiting until the onions themselves are about 6 inches tall, or the tops are, and at that point we'll trim them about half. So what I'm looking to do is just take off some of that greenery off the top. And even if we're doing, planting out onions without paper chains, and doing the same thing, we always trim the tops. You're just able to take off some of that top growth, allow some of that growth to go, the energy to go into the bulb itself. And into the root system, without that root system having to try to support that much green. And not only that, they kind of tangle up. So if we trim them down a little bit, the chains roll out a lot better. The greens aren't tangled together when we get to that point. I would say I think we typically seed out for our climate. We're seeding in the mid-February range. So onions are usually our second thing. So we seed all of our hydroponic tomatoes and cucumbers in that on January 1, and then they go out into the greenhouse on March 1. Onions are usually following the tomatoes. So we'll seed all of our tomatoes. By the time we're starting to transplant those tomatoes into larger cells, those tomato plants, that's about a week and a half. So at that point, we're looking at like the mid to late February timeframe. We seed them then, and typically they're going out at that late April, early May timeframe around here. So what we're looking at for a last frost date, I believe this year is like May. I think we're like May 16th, something like that. We're in that early to mid-May before our frosts are really kind of moving out of the area. So, and onions are very hardy. We can get those out pretty early. So we're able to put those out late April, early May, usually about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks before that last frost date.
So they're in there 10 to 12 weeks.
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes probably longer. By the time we're, that's obviously it's a time frame that we shoot for. And if we're having a wet spring or something, they have to, wait. I know I've had them in these chains for 16 weeks before I've gotten them out. So, there's enough soil in those chains, and I know a lot of people are concerned about that, but I had a whole chain that I didn't put out last year of a white variety, and it just sat in the greenhouse. I just didn't have space for it in the field. I didn't really need it. And I let it sit just because I got busy with other stuff. And the onions in there, they bulbed right up to like those little cipollini type size. They kind of grew right up out of the chain and sat right on top of that, and they were fine. I mean, you wouldn't really want to plant that out, but there's enough soil in there, enough space in there that those onions can actually start to bulb before you have to be concerned about it. So
that second trim, are you doing it relatively close to when you transplant so you don't have long tops, or you just
right? Yeah. The first trim is really to cut the size down. The second trim, we're only taking off maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches at most. You know, where we really cut them in half the first trim, and that takes off the most mass. Let them go from that point, and then, like you said, usually a couple weeks before we're ready to put them out, we'll give them that final trim. We're only taking off a couple, maybe 3 inches at most. At that point, trimming them back just to be manageable, and then that way they're not tangling up with each other.
Having done this with the water wheel and looking to do it again, is there any difference in your treatment of your seedlings in cell trays that are going to go in a water wheel versus paper chains that are being transplanted with a Paperpot transplanter? You know, in terms of timing, trimming, you basically treating them the same?
Yeah, I think the treatment is about the same. You know, it's so with the onions that we're going to hand plant out individually, we just kind of broadcast those into a 10-20, space them out as evenly as you can without getting too precise and driving yourself nuts. But we just broadcast them over the top of a tray, put another 1/2 inch to 1 inch of soil, potting soil over the top, and just let them go. And those, we do the same thing pretty much. You know, they get to that 6-7 inches maybe, and we'll cut them back to 4, let them sit, and then just a couple weeks before we put them out, give them that final trim. Those also, we have to give a little bit of a fertilizer treatment to, or a fertigation treatment to. So we give them a little bit of that all around, you know, plant food, whatever, from Monty's. It seems to be the best that we've found so far. It's a liquid. They're OMRI certified. We're not certified organic, but I like to follow the same practices as often as I can. We haven't used like a chemical of any sorts on our farm in 20 years, and my goal is to never have to. So, but that Monty's product being OMRI certified is pretty good. They got a nice mix. It's enough to really green them up. You can kind of see a little bit of yellowing at the top where that cut was made. You know, that I don't necessarily worry about. It's how yellow the leaves are going down from that towards the bulb. If those outside couple leaves start to yellow up, that's when I start getting a little concerned. I want to get them some nutrient in there, get them to just green up. You know, I'm not looking for them to really set a ton of root. I'm not looking for them to, you know, set their bulbing or start any of that. I just want them to stay green. I think it keeps them going. It stops them from getting a transplant shock per se. So all told, I think the way we handle not only the paper chains, but also the individual planted onions is about the same.
About the same. One other question I had when you're transplanting,
Mm-hmm.
I notice a lot of people will, it's almost like when market gardeners hand transplant lettuce or something, they move pretty fast, and you compare it against a gardener who will put, you know, a plug in the ground and then they tap around it and really neaten it up.
Yeah.
And most market gardeners, they're just flying doing that. Yet a lot of growers using the paper pot, they kind of have that gardener mentality when it comes to doing the paper chains. Like they kind of baby the paper chains, you know, go super slow, really go back and clean up the rows and neaten it all up. I mean, you're planting 150 trays out in one shot, massive amounts of rows there. You're not doing any sort of cleanup on any of these rows, are you?
Well, not a ton. I am, you know, like with the size of our farm. I mean, we're planting somewhere around 20 acres a year, between paper chains and direct seeded, as well as transplants that we're putting out with a water wheel. With transplants, we'll spend a little bit more time, maybe just because we have that time riding the water wheel. It's a little bit less stressful. With the paper chains, I'm pretty confident in the structure of the paper and the chain unit itself. I'm confident in the structure of the soil in those chains or in those cells, and the onion staying where it needs to be, or the transplant staying where it needs to be. So when I start rolling out paper chains, without racing, I'm going for speed. The part of these units is for efficiency as well. So, if you spend a ton of time really babying those cells or coming behind and hand packing or anything like that, like you're losing the efficiency aspect of this whole thing. Part of the goal is to put out 40,000 onions in a day or a day and a half or whatever. So efficiency is what I'm shooting for. I'm looking for speed. That being said, when I talked earlier about that second person following along with a couple extra trays to hand to me as I empty a tray, that person is walking, straddling the row that I'm planting out. And as they're walking, they're just kind of dragging their heels. And that what they're kind of walking like a duck, right? Their feet, their toes pointed out, their heels pointed in, and they're just dragging those heels and filling in any place where it didn't get filled in. But other than that, I mean, we're not coming along hands and knees or any other type of pull unit to really pack that down or do anything like the planter unit itself really does a pretty good job covering those chains up, packing it down. You put those wheels down and it packs it in pretty good. That second person is basically following me to hand me another tray, and they're filling in any place where it was light or, if I hit a rock and the unit lifted up and the chain stayed out of the ground, they'll set those trays down. They'll move that rock out of the way, set those chains in, cover them up by hand, pick up the trays and be right behind me again, ready to go. So we're looking for efficiency and speed as we're doing this. We're not looking for perfection.
Talked a lot about onions here. You've mentioned that you've planted shallots and leeks previously. Yeah. Have you done those in paper chains? And if you haven't, thoughts on doing those in paper chains, how it would translate?
Yeah, we do leeks, shallots, and bunching onions in paper chains. So the bunching onions will do typically like 4 to 6 seeds per cell. And I'm doing those at 4 inches as well. Those come up really nice. I like the way that those grow. They look pretty cool. You get 5 or 6 onions popping up in the same cell. It looks neat. But they do really well in those 4-inch chains as well. I don't have to worry about that too much. Our shallots we're doing all starting from seed. So those, unfortunately, until this year, now I wasn't able to get them pelleted. This year I got them all pelleted. It works way better with that drop seeder that comes with the paper chain unit. Anything pelleted it's a lifesaver. If you try to do raw onion seed in that drop seeder, you'll sleep with a gun in your mouth. It's horrible. Just try, the seeds fall between the two layers and they're dropping into holes. You're double seeding it. We always had issues until we were able to find all the types of seed that we wanted in a pelleted form. That really sped up our planting or our seeding out at the beginning of the year. So this year with we use a variety called Conservor for shallots, and they really grow nice, get nice and big. They're a great looking shallot, and shallots started from seed instead of from bulb or transplant from following year always get bigger. And then with leeks, we'll do leeks. We do a 6-inch chain on the leeks. So that's one of the only onion type plants or crops that we're doing where we're spreading it out further than 4-inch. And what I'll do is I'll put up 2 stakes in a string, and we will use our wheel hoe unit with the 2 plows on it. So what we'll do is run along that string, and we'll actually create this big trench or a big furrow. And then I'll come along with the paper chain unit and drop that unit down into that furrow and roll out all those, the leeks at 6 inches. Once they're all rolled out and packed in, we give them a few days to set roots, and then we start filling that trench back in. And so what we're doing is, because a leek, you want to blanch it as high as you can. The more white on a leek, the more value there is to it. So we'll actually make like a 4-inch deep trench, plant out the leeks into that trench. And then as we're going through and weeding or, just checking things, we'll just walk along like I was talking about earlier with your toes pointed out and your heels pointed in, and just drag your feet and fill those trenches back in slowly. And just allow the leek to grow up in those trenches. And then at that point, then we start hilling them. Once the ground is level again, then we'll start hilling and try to get as much blanched white leek as we can get.
Yeah, right on. Love all the little tips and tricks here for all these onion type crops. Thanks for taking the time to share today, Darren.
Not a problem. Not a problem. I love talking shop.
Right on.